Her mail-order husband rejected her for being black until an Apache warrior looked at her and said, "Wife, July 1880. I ain't shouting," she said at last, her voice softer now, though it carried that edge of stubbornness she always wore like armor. She studied his face, searching for something there, then gave the faintest nod. "All right, Ted." He tapped the ledger with 2 fingers, not unkindly but firm enough to make his point. "You missed a number on that last row." Her eyes rolled almost against her will, a flicker of irritation breaking through her composure. She leaned back over the book, cheeks colored with the faintest blush. "I did not." "You did," he replied, the corner of his mouth tugging upward into that grin he always seemed to pull out at the most inconvenient times. They sat like that a while longer, the fire snapping in the stove, its warmth filling the silence while the prairie wind pressed against the walls, moaning like a restless spirit outside. 2 people who had never been taught what it meant to belong, who had always been told in one way or another that they were too rough, too damaged, too much, sat side by side learning, haltingly, how to build something that felt almost like home. As she corrected the line in the ledger, her hand steady again, he watched her, quietly, with a kind of reverence he'd never admit out loud. In her bent shoulders and her tired eyes he saw not weakness but resilience. He thought, though he would never say it aloud, that the strongest people were the ones who had walked through fire and still found the courage to plant wildflowers in the ashes. The next morning broke gray, heavy, and watchful, the sort of sky that seems to hold its breath before a storm. Dew clung to the grass like strands of glass beads, fragile and shining in the restless breeze. Tessa walked slowly across the pasture, her satchel slung over her shoulder, her boots already damp from the wet earth. Behind her the ranch stood still, a curl of smoke rising from the chimney, the old windmill creaking its familiar complaint in the distance. On the kitchen table she had left a note folded neatly beside his coffee mug. For words, written in her small, careful script. "Thank you for letting me survive." No tear stains, no signatures, no long farewell. Just the kind of message written by someone who never asked for more than a warm roof and a little time to breathe. She did not cry as she walked. Her eyes were dry, her breathing even, her shoulders squared. But each step grew heavier, as if the land itself tugged at her ankles, asking her to stay. She told herself over and over it was time to leave, that she had repaid his kindness, that she had never been meant to stay in one place for long. And yet her heart, uninvited, had begun to root itself in this dirt she once thought too hard to ever call home. At the base of the ridge she reached a shallow creek where the water slid in silver ribbons over polished stone. She lowered herself onto a flat rock, slipped the satchel from her shoulder, and stared into the shifting current. Birdsong flitted through the air, but the only sound she really heard was the steady, aching beat of her own heart. Then came the hoofbeats. She heard them long before she saw him. The rhythm was familiar, measured, and heavy in a way that quickened her breath. When she finally looked up, his silhouette was carved against the pale sky on the ridge above. Tall, broad-shouldered. The way he sat his horse made him instantly recognizable, even with one knee stiff in the saddle. He dismounted slowly, the wince in his jaw betraying pain as his boot struck the earth. For a long moment he stood there, neither approaching nor retreating, just letting the silence stretch between them. Then at last, he walked down the slope, his steps steady and deliberate until he stood near enough to see the crease between her brows, the tension in her mouth. "You left before breakfast," he said softly. She didn't answer. His eyes drifted over the satchel, over the way her arms curled protectively around her knees, over the emptiness of the space she had tried to carve for herself apart from him. He took it all in, then asked, "You think I hired you to muck stalls?" That startled her into lifting her gaze. "I don't think anyone hires someone like me for anything else," she replied quietly. "I was trouble when I came, a burden when I stayed, and I thought maybe it was time to stop pretending otherwise." He lowered himself onto the rock opposite her, slow, careful, like a man approaching a wild thing that might spook if he moved too quickly. His coat brushed the stone, dampened by the creek's spray, but he didn't seem to notice. For a while he said nothing. Only the water spoke, murmuring its restless hymn between them. "You're not a burden," he said at last, his voice carrying none of the command she had come to expect from men, but something gentler. "And if you were trouble, I reckon it's the kind I'd keep close." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Say the things men say when they want a woman to stay." He studied her, head tilted just slightly, like he was trying to read past the walls she had built. "Maybe you're right. Maybe men do that. But I'm not asking you to stay." That caught her off guard. Her brows knit. "Then why follow me?" He leaned his elbows on his knees, clasped his hands together, and stared into the creek as though its shifting water might help him shape his truth. "Because I didn't want you walking away thinking no one saw you. Not the work you did. Not the way you kept this place alive when I was too damn tired to move. Not the way you stood taller every time the world tried to fold you in half. If you go, you go. That's your right. But you're not leaving unseen." Her throat tightened, a lump forming that she swallowed hard against. She wanted to tell him that words like his were dangerous, that they slipped under a woman's skin and made her weak when she had no business being weak. But when she looked at him, really looked, she saw no trap, no scheme, no hunger for ownership. Just a man who had carried his own wounds back from a war no one spoke about, who limped not only in his body but in his soul, and yet still found it in himself to sit in the cold beside a creek simply because she mattered. She looked away first. The water blurred, her reflection bending with the current. "You don't know me," she whispered. "I know enough." Her laugh came short, almost bitter. "That's what they all say. I ain't them." The words landed heavy, not as a defense but as a promise. He didn't raise his voice, didn't press for her to believe it, didn't try to sweeten it with charm. He just said it, and let the truth of it hang in the air, waiting. Her hand moved almost unconsciously to the satchel, fingers brushing over the flap where her mother's old cookbook rested inside. She thought of the letter she'd found tucked there, folded neat, words that had made her chest ache and her hands tremble. Words she had wanted to dismiss but couldn't. She finally asked, "Why did you write it?" His eyes softened, the corners shadowed with something raw. "Because there ain't a man alive who can say everything he should when the moment's in front of him. I've learned that too many times. I didn't want you walking away not knowing the truth, even if I never got the chance to say it with my own mouth." She let the silence stretch again, long and unbroken, broken only by the sigh of the wind threading through the grass on the ridge. The world felt suspended, as if even time itself was waiting for her to decide. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, stripped of all the edges she had sharpened against him. "And what truth is that? That I ain't asking you to be anything but yourself. That if you stayed, it wouldn't be out of debt or pity. It would be because you wanted to. And if you don't, then I'll carry the warmth you left behind like it was enough to last me the rest of my days." Her breath hitched, and this time she didn't hide it. He stood then, slowly, carefully, and adjusted the strap of his coat. He did not reach for her hand. He did not try to take the satchel. He only tipped his hat, a small nod of respect, and turned back toward his horse. His limp was more pronounced now, but he bore it like he always did, without complaint, without apology. She watched him climb the ridge, the silhouette growing smaller against the horizon, until he was just a shadow folding into the pale sky. Only then did she realize she was gripping the satchel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her chest rose and fell in a rhythm she could barely control, the creek whispering on as though it knew the choice she had to make would not come quickly, nor easily. The sun had nearly slipped behind the ridge when she finally stirred. Her legs were stiff from sitting too long on the cold stone, but she forced herself to stand, though her body felt as if it carried twice its weight. She slung the satchel over her shoulder, pulled her shawl tighter, and set her boots to the trail. At first, she walked the way she had meant to from the beginning. North, toward no one, toward whatever town might take her, toward whatever silence would let her disappear. Each step felt heavy, but her pride carried her farther than her will. The prairie wind stung her eyes, and the ache in her chest throbbed with every heartbeat. Yet she pressed on. But then, the memory of the fire returned, sudden and sharp. The roar of the flames in her ears, the choking smoke, the way her body had sagged against his arms as he shielded her with his own. His cheek seared, his coat smoldering, and yet he had not let go. She tried to banish the thought, tried to remind herself she owed him nothing. But memory is a stubborn thing. It clung to her ribs like a thorn that could not be pulled. By the time she reached the fork where the trail bent into the wide, open valley, her feet slowed. The horizon stretched endless, pale and cruel in its emptiness. No smoke curled from chimneys. No lanterns glowed in windows. Just miles of cold earth that would not soften no matter how far she walked. She stopped. Her breath came out in a shudder, clouding the air before her. Her hands trembled at her sides. In the distance behind her, faint and dim, she could see the shape of the ranch. Just the roof lines and a thin smudge of chimney smoke rising into the darkening sky. Small, fragile, but real. She closed her eyes. She thought of the tin cup always waiting, already filled. She thought of the ledger hidden under the sacks, of her mother's recipes written in her own careful hand. She thought of his voice, low, uncertain, but true. I want to be something better than I was. Her eyes opened, and then, as though her heart decided faster than her mind, she turned. The first step back felt impossible. The second, heavier. But the third came easier, and by the time she had retraced 10 paces, her chest no longer felt like it would split open. She walked faster, her shawl tugging in the wind, her satchel bumping against her side. The ridge came into view, and beyond it, the dim glow of lanterns lit in the windows. She could see movement, shadows crossing the yard, men calling out as they carried feed, the simple rhythm of a place that did not know it had almost lost her. And there, by the hitching post, his coat still dusted with snow, his limp pulling at each step, stood Caleb. He had not gone inside. He had not gone to supper. He had waited. When he saw her, he didn't move right away. His hand rested on the saddle horn, his body taut as though afraid she might vanish if he blinked. But when she kept walking, straight toward him, her chin lifted, her shoulders squared, something in his frame eased. She stopped just short of him, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath in the cold air. For a long time neither spoke. Then she set her satchel down on the packed dirt between them, as if to anchor herself. Her voice was soft but steady. If I stay, it's not because I owe you. He nodded once. I know. And it's not because I need saving. I know that too. She drew in a breath, her hands curling into the fabric of her apron. Then why would you want me here? His eyes met hers, steady, unwavering, stripped of all the defenses a man might use. Because when you're here, this place feels like more than just work and weather. Feels like home. The words broke something loose inside her. She did not weep. She had shed enough tears for a lifetime. But her jaw softened, her shoulders eased, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe that perhaps belonging was not weakness. Slowly, she bent down, lifted the satchel, and carried it past him toward the warm light spilling from the cookhouse window. He turned with her, not leading, not pressing, just walking at her side. When they reached the porch, she paused, her hand on the rail. She looked back at him. He waited, still as stone, until she gave the smallest nod, a gesture that said more than words could hold. And together, without fanfare, without the world watching, they stepped inside. The man who sent for me had never seen my soul. He only saw my skin. When he left me in the dirt, it was as if I'd been worth less than the cattle he traded. Taza studied her face, expression unreadable, the firelight carving lines of shadow across his scar. She did not know if he pitied her or judged her, until he lifted a calloused hand and touched his chest. Pain, she said, pointing to her own heart. His eyes flickered, and he nodded once. Same. The cave walls shivered with the desert wind, a low howl threading through the cracks like an old song. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not love, not yet, but a recognition, of sorrow carried too long, of scars worn like armor, of survival earned breath by breath. Time did not move here the way it did in towns. There were no clocks striking hours, no trains screaming through stations, no church bells dictating when to kneel. Only the desert's rhythm, wind against stone, the swing of the sun, the steady beat of firelight. Ruth forgot the days, but she remembered the sky. Angry blue melting to gentle gray, the brittle stillness before rain, the sudden scent of it rising from dry earth. She stayed in the cave, though she built herself a lean-to from sticks and hides, crooked at first until Taza silently helped her brace the post. No words, only nods, hands passing wood. She rose early each morning, sweeping dust from the stone floor, stirring embers, boiling bitter roots for tea. Sometimes he was gone before dawn, returning with rabbits, cactus fruit, or mesquite pods. Sometimes he came back wounded, a new scar running like a river across his skin. She never asked. He never explained. At night she cooked what little they had. She stitched his worn blanket, clumsy but careful. He carved her a second bowl from a hollowed gourd. They lived like that, no longer strangers, not yet lovers, balanced on something fragile in between. She noticed the way he turned his face from her when the fire was brightest, hiding the scar. The way his hand hovered near the knife even when she was only chopping roots. And the way, once, when she laughed, a low, surprised sound he had never heard before. His eyes softened, as if the desert itself had paused to listen. One morning, the square of cloth she'd stitched with blue thread vanished from her lean-to. By afternoon she found it tied carefully at the top of his spear, fluttering in the wind like a prayer. She said nothing, but that night her hands shook when she stirred the stew. Later, when shadows crept up the cave walls, she tried not to let him see the fear in her eyes. Darkness had always hunted her. He noticed. He left without a word, returned with stones, flint, and wood. He built a small fire pit beside her lean-to, low and shielded from the wind. A second flame, a sentinel. It burned every night after, and she slept easier knowing it waited. Then the sky broke open. Thunder rolled low as a stampede, and rain hammered the cave roof. Ruth stepped outside, arms wide, face lifted, drenched and laughing. For the first time in weeks, laughter poured out of her unguarded. Taza stood in the cave mouth watching, silent, as though her joy was too sacred to touch. Later, wrapped in a blanket, she hummed while combing her hair, then sang softly, a lullaby her mother used to sing beneath magnolia trees. Half the words lost, but the melody alive in her bones. Sleep, little one. Hush now. Taza closed his eyes, listening as though the sound itself carried him beyond the cave. When she finished, silence stretched. Only the fire crackled, only the rain. Then he spoke, each word slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone and used to giving them away. Your voice makes the dead want to live again. The comb trembled in her hand. Her breath caught. She raised her eyes to his, and in them she saw unhealed wounds, unspoken longing, and something dangerous, hope. That, she whispered, is the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me. He did not answer. He only turned back to the cave entrance and kept watch through the night, rain soaking his shoulders, the fire he built for her burning steady until dawn. But peace cannot root in desert soil for long. Whispers began to crawl through the wind. A rider claimed to have seen a dark-skinned woman singing near a fire that was not Apache. Another said Taza hunted alone but carried food for two. The most poisonous voice belonged to Kem, a bitter young warrior passed over years ago when the elders favored Taza's plan instead of his. He carried the grudge like a second knife. It was Kem who rode through the night and knelt before the council. Taza shelters a woman, he spat. Not of our people. A stranger. A black woman. The elders stirred. They had tolerated Taza, scarred, haunted, silent, useful but never beloved. But this? A curse? Kem hissed. A shadow woman. She will bring death. By dawn, two elders arrived at the stone shelter. Ruth was feeding the fire when they dismounted. Their eyes weighed her like judgment. She could not understand their words, but she knew the meaning. Come. Taza returned as they led her away. He stepped between them. No, he said, low and certain. This is not your place to decide, the elder warned. She is with me. She is not one of us. She saved me. She bled to heal me. She sings when the wind would kill. She brings eyes from the outside, the elder said sharply. She draws trouble. Soldiers will come. Taza fell silent. The elders turned to Ruth. She will be judged, one said. Tonight. He did not stop them with force, but he followed every step. At dusk, under the great tree, the people gathered. Children peered from behind their mothers. Warriors muttered. Ruth stood alone in the circle, Taza beside her. Kem spat first. Already soldiers hunt us like dogs. And now this? Do we keep outsiders, dark ones? Do we forget the old ways? Murmurs swelled. An elder raised his staff. Taza, speak. He stepped forward, then dropped to one knee. With a swift motion, he drove his spear into the earth. If she leaves, he said, voice carrying like thunder. I leave. Gasps rippled through the circle. If you call me traitor, take my head. Take my honor. But let her go free. He bowed his head. Ruth's breath caught. No one moved. Then the eldest stepped forward, his voice slow and steady. There is no tradition older than honor. She stays or she goes, but by her own choice. The storm passed, but the wind had changed. That night, Taza and Ruth packed what little they owned and slipped away, not outcasts but no longer safe. For a while the desert was kind. Then one morning Ruth found something pinned to their fence. A scrap of paper, a faded photograph. Her father, Sunday coat and solemn face. The same image she had once carried west, lost on the train. Her hands shook as she read the words. Come to the river bend near the trading post. I am here, waiting. The photo was real. The words too cruelly perfect. She didn't wait for Taza. She gathered water, packed her satchel, and set out alone. At the river bend she saw them. 3 figures near a broken wagon. One broad, one lean, one with a rifle. Her stomach dropped. Richard. His smile was all teeth. Took you long enough. Her blood turned cold. You, she whispered, always were gullible. He stepped closer. When she tried to run, rough hands caught her, rope biting into her wrists. You wrote that letter. He laughed. Who else? You thought your holy daddy came all the way out here for you? Please. He leaned close, breath hot with tobacco. Turns out you're worth more now than you ever were in a wedding dress. Some buyers like the rare ones. You're a monster, she spat. His hand cracked across her cheek. She tasted blood, but she didn't scream. That same hour, miles away, Taza returned to silence. No Ruth, no fire. Footprints in the dust, some small, some heavy with boot leather. He knelt, fingers grazing a bent blade of grass, a broken twig. His eyes narrowed. He did not rage. He prepared. That night, under a half moon, he painted 2 black lines of ash across his chest, the mark of a lone avenger. He took his brother's bow, his bone knife, the long spear carved with symbols of protection, and he moved into the desert like a shadow. The canyon came into view by midnight, jagged and black against the clouded sky. A fire burned low in its gut. Ruth sat bound, wrists raw, lips split. Richard drank from a flask, boasting. Dalton chewed tobacco, spitting into the dirt. Luke Jensen cleaned his rifle, eyes never leaving her. And above them, silent as stone, Taza watched. They came barefoot, in dusty boots, in torn shirts, carrying nothing but questions and wide eyes. Ruth would kneel with them on the floor, tracing letters in spilled flour, telling stories between lessons. Some of the Apache children had never heard English spoken gently before. Some of the miners' children had never heard Apache spoken at all. In that small kitchen with its clay stove and cracked windows, both languages lived together, braided like rope. Taza would return from hunting at dusk, a deer slung across his shoulders or a string of rabbits tied at his belt, and pause in the doorway. He would stand quietly, listening to the laughter spilling from that room, his warrior's heart softening in the glow of his wife's voice. For a man who had been told he had no tribe, no right to belong, the sound of children repeating Ruth's words became a kind of belonging he had never dreamed possible. Years passed. The scars on his side faded, though on cold mornings they still ached. Ruth's hands grew rougher from work, yet her smile deepened, lines of love etched at the corners of her eyes. Together they built more than a home, they built a refuge. Travelers came and went, carrying whispers of the couple who had once defied a town, who had once stood against the law and the rope and the gun. Some called them reckless, others called them foolish. But those who stayed long enough, who ate Ruth's bread or sat by Taz's fire, called them something else entirely: family. On summer nights, when the air was thick with crickets and the stars bled bright over the desert, Ruth and Taza would sit on the porch, shoulders pressed together. Sometimes they said nothing. Sometimes he told her old Apache tales of mountains that walked and rivers that sang. Sometimes she told him stories of green hills back east, of winters where snow lay deep and soft as feathers. Both knew they would never see those places again. And both knew they did not need to, because what they had built in that borderland, among coyote tracks and cactus blooms, among sweat and fire and hard-won forgiveness, was enough. More than enough. It was proof that love could survive bullets, survive blood, survive the voices of men who swore it should never have existed. And when the wind carried dust across their land, rattling the windows and howling like ghosts of all they had lost, Ruth would take Taz's hand, squeeze once, and whisper, "We're still here." He would turn to her, his eyes dark and steady, and answer in the only vow he had ever truly meant, "Always." Dawn came slow over the desert, stretching pale fingers of light across the canyon walls. The embers of last night's fire still glowed, their faint warmth trembling against the chill of morning. Taza lay motionless on the ground, his chest rising shallow but steady, the weight of his wounds pressing him close to silence. Ruth had not left him, not once. Through the long night she fought the dark with her bare hands, tearing strips from her skirt to bind the wound, crushing desert herbs with trembling fingers, whispering his name as if her voice alone could anchor him to the earth. By the time the Apache riders appeared, drawn by the echoes of battle and the warning sent ahead by a young scout, Ruth was already streaked with blood and ash, her arms wrapped around the man who had risked everything to keep her free. The elders said nothing at first. They did not need to. The blood on her palms, the fire in her eyes, the way she cradled his head like something holy, all told them more than words ever could. One of the oldest warriors, his hair silver with years, knelt beside her and whispered, "You saved him." Ruth's reply came soft, but steady, "No, he saved me." They lifted Taza onto a stretcher of hide and wood, and for 3 days he lingered between silence and sleep. Ruth never left. She pressed cool cloths against his fevered skin, poured water past his lips when he could not swallow, and whispered stories into his dreams. When at last his eyes opened, blurred with pain but burning with life, his first word was her name. Far from that canyon, Dalton, the rattlesnake Jeb had sent to do his bidding, swung upside down from a mesquite branch, bound and humiliated. His curses echoed hollow in the wind until even rage abandoned him. When a patrol of Mexican border guards found him, they laughed. By sundown he was shackled in the back of a wagon, awaiting trial for trafficking and attempted kidnapping. Luke Crow Jensen awoke alone in the dust. The fire was cold, his rifle gone, the world around him emptied of violence. Across his chest lay Ruth's shawl, torn, blood-stained, but unmistakably soft. He touched it once, folded it gently, and placed it on a stone. Without a word, he disappeared down the trail. Some say he wandered south, never to kill again. As for Richard Moore, the man who once thought power gave him ownership, his flight ended in failure. Burned, broken, and bound, he was dragged to the edge of Dust Creek by the very people he had once manipulated. Townsfolk who had sneered at Ruth now stood silent as the sheriff took him into custody. He screamed at them, "Cowards, liars, traitors." But this time the law did not look away. This time, Dust Creek remembered its soul. But Ruth and Taza were not there to see it. Before the sun touched the horizon, they were already gone, hand in hand beneath a sky painted in pale pink and gold. They crossed dry riverbeds and canyon trails, the wild borderland of Arizona unfolding before them. A place of no fences, no papers, no masters, a place that answered to no one's rule but the wind. There, among the saguaros standing like sentinels and the bright blooms of prickly pear, they built a home. It was simple, 3 rooms of stone, timber, and canvas, hammered together with sunburned hands. But it stood firm against the storms. Above the doorway, Taza carved words with his hunting knife, crooked but careful. Where no darkness touches her. Cactus flowers grew along the steps. Ruth planted corn between stones, coaxing life from the hard desert. And soon, children from mining camps and Apache families began to wander close, drawn by the smell of her bread and the sound of her humming. She opened the door freely. Her kitchen became a classroom. Brown, black, copper, cream. Children of every shade sat side by side, scratching letters onto wood, learning the language of one another's dreams. Ruth never asked about their fathers. She only asked about their futures. Taza healed in time. His scar remained, but he wore it proudly. He carved again. He laughed again. And one spring morning, after the rains had turned the desert green, a little girl ran barefoot across the yard, her curls bouncing, her voice clear as birdsong. "Papa, come see what I found." He did not fight when Ruth took the same ropes he had once bound her with and tied his hands behind his back. The desert was silent except for the ragged breath of Taza, who lay bleeding, his skin ashen, his chest rising in shallow gasps. Ruth knelt beside him, her hands trembling, her lap cradling his head as if he were the last fragile thing in a broken world. Tears fell freely, streaking through the dust on her face. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You came for me." His eyes fluttered, heavy with pain, but when they met hers, a faint smile touched his lips. His breath was weak, but his word was steady. "Always," he murmured. The fire crackled low, its glow dimming against the vast night. Overhead, the clouds broke apart, and the first stars returned, cold and endless, bearing silent witness. There, in the canyon's lonely hollow, a man without a tribe and a woman without a home clung to one another, choosing love in a place no one else dared to believe it could survive. Dawn came slow, stretching across the desert like a long, drawn breath. The embers still smoldered, casting a thin warmth against the canyon's cold stone. Taza lay still, his body weak but alive, breath shallow but steady. Ruth had not left him, not for a heartbeat, her strength becoming his anchor through the endless night. By the time the Apache riders arrived, summoned by the echo of battle and the warning carried by the young warrior, she had already done what she could. She had torn strips from her own skirt to clean his wound, pressed herbs into the gash with bare, blistered hands, and held the bleeding fast until it slowed. The riders saw her there, dust on her face, blood on her hands, her eyes fierce and unyielding, and they did not question. They saw the truth before words were spoken. One elder dismounted and knelt beside her. His weathered hand rested briefly on her shoulder. His voice was low, steady as the earth. "You saved him." Ruth shook her head, tears catching in the lines of dirt across her cheeks. Her voice was hoarse, but sure. "No, he saved me." Taza lifted her easily into his arms. Ruth watched from the doorway, her heart full as the desert sky. The wind carried their laughter, and for a moment the past was only a shadow fading behind them. She whispered, not for him, not for the child, but for the earth itself. "I was never your wife on paper, but I am your wife in the dust, in the fire, in the vow you made when death stood between us." Taza turned, his smile quiet but certain, and in that moment the desert itself seemed to answer. For the first time it was not exile, it was home, because in a land where law bent to greed and love was often left to die in silence, Ruth and Taza endured. Their story was not written in ledgers or sealed in church records. It was carved into the dust, sealed in blood, and carried across cactus fields by those who still believe in the power of a vow. The riders moved quickly, their voices low but urgent, their hands sure. A litter was fashioned from spears and hides, and with care they lifted Taza's broken body onto it. Ruth rose only when they did, her knees stiff, her palms raw from hours pressed against his wound. She walked beside him, her hand never leaving the edge of the stretcher, as if her touch alone tethered him to the living. The desert was quiet, the only sound the shuffle of hooves and the groan of leather. The sun climbed slowly, painting the ridges in gold, but Ruth felt none of its warmth. All she saw was Taza, his face pale, his chest rising too faintly, his lips moving with words that never came. They reached the Apache camp by dusk. A circle of firelight welcomed them, shadows bending low in reverence. Women rushed forward with water and clean cloth. An elder healer, his hair silvered by years and wind, bent over Taza, murmuring prayers as he worked. Ruth hovered close, her fingers twisting at the hem of her ruined dress. She would have given anything to take his pain, to trade her breath for his. The healers worked deep into the night. Ruth remained at his side, refusing food, refusing rest. She washed his face with cool water, brushed the dust from his hair, whispered words he could not hear. The camp around her blurred. Faces, fires, the rhythm of drums. All of it faded into the background. There was only Taza. 3 days passed. 3 days of silence, when she measured the hours by the rise and fall of his chest. She spoke to him sometimes, quietly, as if her voice could guide him back. Stories of the places she had dreamed of seeing, the books her father once read to her, the recipes her mother scrawled on scraps of linen. Sometimes, when exhaustion stole her words, she sang instead, low and broken, but steady, a song that carried the weight of waiting. On the morning of the 4th day, as the sky blushed with the first light of dawn, his fingers twitched against hers. Ruth stilled, afraid to breathe. His lips moved, dry and cracked, shaping a sound too faint to catch. She leaned close, her heart in her throat. Ruth, her name, hoarse, fragile, but alive. The tears came before she could stop them. She pressed his hand to her cheek, her voice breaking as she whispered back, "I'm here. I'm right here." And for the first time since the canyon, hope rooted itself deep in her chest. Not the desperate kind that flickered and burned out, but the quiet, steady kind that promised there was still a road ahead, if only they had the strength to walk it together. So if this story moved you, if you felt the ache, the fire, and the triumph of a love that refused to be broken, subscribe to Legend of Love Stories. Because here, we honor the forgotten hearts, the untold romances, the fierce beauty of love that outlived bullets, borders, and bloodlines. This is where the frontier meets the soul, where bullets may miss, but hearts never do. This is Legend of Love Stories.